Hey everyone, it's Thomas, and I'm just going to do my teach back today on Chapter 7 of our book, Community Youth Development, the chapter on adolescent sexuality and positive youth development. Just as we go here, I'm going to introduce the topic. I'm going to do an overview, a summary of the chapter, followed by I jumped ahead, three specific applications of it. One is to local education, one is to current programs that I work, and then the third one is to increase mentorship and one-on-one stuff with youth. Finally, concluding with biblical principles and what it has to say about adolescent sexuality. And so as we start here, I want to start with a quote saying that we live in a culture that is not comfortable with sexuality or with adolescence, and least comfortable of all with the notion of adolescent sexuality. And this, I think, perfectly conveys that this is a very uncomfortable topic for us. This is something that so often our society just doesn't want to engage with. And we'll discuss a lot of the reasons why we struggle with this. But to start, the chapter presents an understanding of sexuality that is different than we normally perceive it. Sexuality, especially adolescent sexuality, is normally understood as sexual activities and behaviors. Specifically, a lot of our thoughts focus on early sexual activity, promiscuity, and pregnancy. Very deficit-focused, very problem-focused. These are problems that are not good, and therefore we need to not think about sexuality in our youth, or we need to stop them from being sexual. When in reality, sexuality development is attitudes, behaviors, and identity. It's everything from your first crush that you have, the first kiss, holding hands, going on a date, all the way through to sexual intercourse and discovering, what is my sexual identity? What is my sexual orientation? Am I a sexual being? All of these things, that is sexuality development, and it is part of our youth development. Healthy adolescent maturation includes sexuality development. And for us to avoid it, for us to not talk about it, is a huge disservice to our youth. It is so much more than just sexual activities, and it is something important that we need to do, and it's something that we need to help our youth do. And so what are the challenges? I mentioned this briefly. One of the big challenges is the fact that there is this huge gap between when youth reach sexual maturity and when they achieve social maturity. They might be sexually mature and ready to engage in any variety of sexual behaviors, but they're still living in their parents' house, or they're still living in some form of care. And so there's this gap between their desires, their sexual inclinations, and the expectations that are placed on them. They aren't trusted to make the right choices about things. And so that's a big challenge. That's a big barrier. Secondly, there's mixed messages about sexuality, whether it's from their parents, their peers, from media. They get all these different things. Oh, sex is just for marriage and for procreation. Oh, sex is for fun. Being sexy is a huge thing that's in the media, and it's like, that's important. That's what you need to be. And so there's all these different messages that youth, and for that matter, culture, are wrestling with. There's also a whole variety of fears regarding doing youth development and including sexuality. One is that we're afraid that there's going to be generational differences. The previous generation doesn't trust the younger generation to develop the same values, when research actually shows that generationally, that's how values are passed. Youth might be influenced by their peers as far as music and clothing, movies, but not as much about values. That's what research shows. Secondly, there's a fear that teenagers can't make choices that are healthy for them, which again, this is untrue. Teenagers actually show and develop the ability to make health-promoting choices. And so to not trust them with that is a disservice, because then they don't gain the expertise in order to make those choices later on. And thirdly, there's fear that if we talk about sex, if we talk about sexuality, youth are going to engage in those behaviors. Finally, one of the biggest challenges, and perhaps the biggest challenge, is the fact that there's so many different values. Sex and sexuality is a very personally and deeply held belief by a lot of people, and so that actually creates a lot of barriers. It's sometimes hard to find common ground. And so with these barriers, what has been the response normally? And well, the normal response has been sexual education, and this has had two goals: one, to provide information, and secondly, to delay activity and increase sexual behavior. The history of it in the 80s, it increased knowledge, didn't necessarily impact behavior and attitudes. And then in Clinton's era, in the 90s, there were norms. It was abstinence only type teaching. Sex is for marriage. That was the extent of it. And there's been three kind of models. One is abstinence only. Again, that is sex is not till marriage. That's more or less the extent of the education. Then there's abstinence-based, which provides more options, provides more knowledge, but again is heavily promoting an abstinence lifestyle. And thirdly, there's comprehensive sexuality education, and that's essentially providing the options, providing the education, and allowing for youth to make the choice. Of note, there's little evidence that supports that abstinence-only approaches have any effect in decreasing problematic sexual behaviors. So what does work? Well, positive youth development and youth development programs. Indicators of effective programs in promoting sexual health outcomes have an emphasis on education, employment, and life options. They address cognitive and social skills. They address social norms and values. They set clear goals, and they're ongoing and involve diverse experiential methods. They don't really actually look much like a sexuality education or development program. They're more of a life development program. But these are the types of programs that lead to positive sexual health outcomes like postponed sexual activity, a reduced risk of pregnancy and parenthood. Another key to a lot of these programs is the involvement of adults in the life of youth. And caring adults, as we know in youth development in any form, have a huge role to play. One, especially in sexuality, they have a role to help young people clarify sexual identities. They also need to provide education and experiences. That's part of the programming. And they also just need to guide adolescents through all the competing values that are being thrown at them. Again, media, parents, peers, even the youth workers themselves all have these values that they're kind of giving to the kids. And youth just need somebody to kind of walk alongside and help them develop that. There is a general sense that there is kind of a minimum value, a minimum, like we need to make sure that youth achieve this sort of view on sexual expression, and that is that sex is to be consensual, non-exploitative, honest, pleasurable, and protected against disease and unintended pregnancy. But beyond that, there's all these other values that youth are trying to negotiate, and that's what a caring adult is there for. So with this in mind, the chapter presents 3 action steps, 3 action areas in order to help implementation. The first is, as an individual, we need to assess our personal values. Where are we coming from? How do we view sex, sexuality, all of that? What is our own personal comfort in dealing with a lot of these difficult topics? And then thirdly is, what is our knowledge? Do we actually know what youth need at certain ages? Secondly, on an institutional level, there's, again, a need to assess, what previous efforts have been made at helping adolescents develop sexually or developing their sexuality. And then also, what are the values of those involved in the organization? And again, if there's a resistance to teaching and working in sexuality development, educate. Why is this important? And finally, as a community, there's a need to build a network of community stakeholders. Again, there are so many differing community values. So how can we bring people together, know what's going on in the community, educate about the importance of this, and then involve youth in this whole process? They need to be part of their own development. We've seen that in all forms of positive youth development. So how does this apply to local context? Well, one, schools. Obviously, schools are a huge part of teaching about sexual education and sexuality development. And here in British Columbia, in my home province, in my area, there is a guideline provided to teachers. And actually, it encompasses a lot of these things. It has a positive approach or positive view of sexuality. It expands beyond just simply the action of sexual intercourse or other sexual activities. It also trusts youth and helps youth make safe decision-making towards healthy behaviors, and it's very inclusive. All very important things, and I think that are promoted by positive youth development. There are some concerns whether the curriculum is too vague, whether teachers are properly trained. Just like as individuals, we need to make sure that we know we are comfortable, all of that. And thirdly, maybe there's a lack of caring adult guidance. Teacher and students often have like a barrier between them, and so there needs to still be someone that's walking alongside of the youth. And so one way of meeting that need is to provide other youth programs. And where I currently work, we have teen programming that focuses on life, social, emotional skills, supports in that way. we have engaged in some sexuality development before, whether it's online safety, sexual integrity workshops, which kind of look at sex as a holistic thing. It's more than just a physical act, it's emotional and spiritual, as well as providing the sexuality question panel where we have a whole bunch of adults that the kids, the youth are able to ask questions and feel comfortable just doing that. However, there still is a need to improve based on this model, and that is to increase staff education. What do we know? How can we do this better? We need to clarify what exactly our values are. What are the values of our community? We need to know that. And thirdly, there's a need to just have this regularly be part of our program, to regularly be doing that. And then the third application is on this idea of mentorship, of having someone to walk alongside. At the bottom here, I have a quote saying, "Sexuality is often the dimension of adolescents' lives for which adult guidance and support is absent." And this is a huge loss for youth that, we might walk alongside them in everything from school to work to all, but are we walking alongside of them as they figure out their sexuality? And that's crucial. And again, going back to what's the role of a caring adult, it's to navigate the values. There's a research study from 2014 that shows that peers and parental influence is huge on sexual values and behaviors. And so how can we help youth develop that during their key developmental years? And there's also just a need to partner with youth to help them navigate their different values, to help them navigate all the different options that are available to them. And so it is crucial for us as caring adults to engage with youth on a one-on-one basis, on a small group basis, helping them from everything from school to work to their sexuality development, and to not do that as a disservice. And we find that actually in Scripture. And so to close, we'll just briefly look at Scripture. As I've kind of said, in my experience, there have been challenges when it comes to sexuality in church, sexuality in youth group. And a lot of that is based on many of the warnings against sexual immorality. And I think those are crucial as God put them there for a reason. But if we solely focus on that, we're focused on the deficits again. We're focused on those problem behaviors. It puts up barriers to help us actually discuss what is healthy sexuality. And also it's been a basis for a lot of abstinence-only programs that don't have much success in promoting healthy behaviors. Another thing to note is that the sexual social maturity gap that I discussed earlier was non-existent in the time that Scripture was written. A lot of times sexual maturity would be reached at the same time as social maturity. And so for our youth, I found in Scripture, and I had a hard time trying to figure out what exactly does Scripture say about all this, but God made humans to be sexual beings. We see that from the very beginning in Genesis, that Adam and Eve were together, that God intended people to be united, and sex was part of that union. It was to become one flesh. We also see in Scripture in examples where Luke 2:52 with Jesus and 1 Samuel with Samuel, that there's holistic youth growth, that children and youth are supposed to grow in wisdom, stature, and in favor with God and man. And part of that is their sexuality. And to not engage them in that is a huge disservice. And finally, as I read through Scripture and kind of try to sift out through the warnings against sexual immorality, there is this beautiful image of oneness that is connected with sexuality. And sexuality, healthy sexuality, allows us to experience unity and oneness with another. And Paul describes this as a profound mystery, but I am talking about Christ and the church. And so there's this beautiful thing that happens, and I don't get it. And I think even Paul is admitting that he doesn't get it, but there is this union that happens through our sexuality with another that gives us a glimpse into God's relationship with us. And so when we don't engage our youth in developing their healthy sexuality, then we do it again. They're missing out on this beautiful thing that God has designed us for. And so, yeah, that's what I have to say. Again, here are my references. It is crucial that we walk alongside our youth in navigating their sexual development. So thanks for listening.